We often hear from the pro-LGBT crowd that the only difference between homosexuals and heterosexuals is their sexual attraction to the same sex. But as I will explain, the claim that LGBT relationships even remotely resemble what the rest of us would consider healthy, monogamous heterosexuality and marriage is nothing more than a sick, twisted joke. I'll be focusing mainly on male homosexuals in this video, but I'll be exposing the dysfunction of lesbian relationships in a future video. Decades of research by social scientists has shown that male homosexuals in particular are basically incapable of monogamy, let alone marriage. You have probably heard people talk about knowing two homosexual men who have been together for many years, and they will attempt to use this as proof of homosexuals being capable of monogamy and marriage. Unfortunately, being together for any length of time doesn't mean that homosexuals are monogamous. In fact, in the vast majority of cases, they are not. Some may say that not all heterosexuals are monogamous, and of course this is true, especially in today's rapidly decaying society. But even the most promiscuous heterosexual would have a very hard time matching numbers even close to the average homosexual male. And besides, the majority of heterosexual couples do practice monogamy. And when infidelity occurs, it is nearly always accompanied by extreme heartbreak. Whereas for homosexual males, infidelity is frequently an openly celebrated and even necessary part of their romantic relationships. Amongst heterosexuals, infidelity is nearly universally frowned upon. Whereas for homosexuals, infidelity is seen as normal and even desirable. Homosexual activists Marshall Kirk and Hunter Madsen admitted in their own pro-homosexuality activism book that the cheating ratio of married gay males given enough time approaches 100%. The gay community has never had any tradition of faithfulness. Many gay lovers bowing to the inevitable agree to an open relationship. Homosexual men cohabit for many years because of convenience. The lovers, or we should say roommates, tend to become mere collaborators on the prowl, helping each other look for tricks to take home for a ménage à trois. It is indeed our impression that when gay relationships last at all, it's in diluted form, as the result of some such accommodation. But they don't usually last. Eventually, one party heads for the door. Gay men feel free to treat unsatisfactory relationships like Kleenex. Gays reject morality, offering any one of a variety of reasons for doing so. The more outrageous the behavior, the more it is to be seen as celebrating our unique sensibility and culture. The less ethically defensible, the less one is to feel entitled to speak out against it. Former homosexual William Aaron explains why even homosexuals involved in committed relationships do not practice monogamy. In the gay life, fidelity is almost impossible. Since part of the compulsion of homosexuality is a need on the part of the homophile to absorb masculinity from his sexual partners, he must be constantly on the lookout for new partners. Consequently, the most successful homophile marriages are those where there is an arrangement between the two to have affairs on the side while maintaining the semblance of permanence in their living arrangement. Another homosexual activist admits that homosexuals have a very different definition of monogamy than heterosexuals. For homosexual males, the term monogamy simply doesn't mean sexual exclusivity. For homosexual men, monogamy means a relationship in which the partners have sex on the outside often, put away the resentment and jealousy, and discuss their outside sex with each other, and share sex partners. He further admits why homosexuals wanted to be allowed to legally marry, to fight for same-sex marriage and its benefits, and then, once granted, redefine the institution of marriage completely, to demand the right to marry not as a way of adhering to society's moral codes, but rather to debunk a myth and radically alter an archaic institution. It is also a chance to wholly transform the definition of family in American culture. It is the final tool with which to dismantle all sodomy statutes, get education about homosexuality into public schools, and, in short, usher in a sea of change in how society views and treats us. A study of 156 males in homosexual relationships found that all the couples with a relationship lasting more than 5 years had agreed to outside sexual activity in their relationships. As the authors explain, outside sexual activity is the rule for male couples and the exception for heterosexuals. Even a lesbian activist admits that homosexuals celebrate sex with strangers and propose monogamy without fidelity, the latest Orwellian formulation to excuse having your cake and eating it too. Another homosexual activist, who later died of AIDS as a direct result of being a homosexual male, said that enlarging the concept of marriage to embrace same-sex couples would necessarily transform marriage into something new, extending the right to marry to gay people, that is, abolishing the traditional gender requirements of marriage, can be one of the means, perhaps the principal one, through which the institution of marriage divests itself of the trappings of the past. As another homosexual activist admits, it's a no-brainer we should have the right to marry. I also think equally that it's a no-brainer that the institution of marriage should not exist. Fighting for gay marriage involves lying about what we're going to do with marriage when we get there. Because we lie that the institution of marriage is not going to change, and that is a lie. The institution of marriage is going to change, and it should change, and again, I don't think it should exist. I have 3 kids, and they have 5 parents more or less, and I don't see why they shouldn't have 5 parents legally. I don't see why we should choose 2 of those parents and make them into a sanctioned couple. Dr. Lorraine Day is the former chief of orthopedic surgery at San Francisco General Hospital, as well as an AIDS and LGBT expert who performed emergency surgeries on male homosexuals for over 20 years. In her book, based on her decades of first-hand experience with homosexuals, she says, "A monogamous homosexual relationship, if indeed it exists at all, is extremely difficult to find, and semen in contact with the rectal mucosa, whether the partner is a monogamous or a promiscuous partner, or whether the anal recipient of the semen is male or female, it is still damaging to the recipient's immune system." To illustrate just how promiscuous male homosexuals are, during the mid and late 1980s when medical studies tracking the transmission of AIDS in the homosexual population were first planned, a decision had to be made by the medical experts to separate homosexuals in stable relationships from those engaged in promiscuous behavior. The homosexual community was found to be so promiscuous that a stable relationship was finally defined as a relationship in which the same 2 men had sex with each other more than twice. Obviously, the word stable did not mean stable at all. It was nothing more than a way of propagandizing the public, more appropriately called lying, implying to the heterosexual community that there are stable homosexual relationships. Every physician reading the article would see the word stable, but its actual definition was nowhere to be found. Here is Dr. Lorraine Day speaking of a homosexual male that she personally knew very well. He died 10 years ago from liver cancer caused by chronic hepatitis B that he had contracted from one or more of his numerous sexual partners. After he knew he was going to die, but before his final illness overtook him, his last act was to fly to Thailand to have sex with as many young boys as his remaining money could buy. I personally know a man who worked for many years in hospice, caring for homosexual men who were dying of AIDS, and he told me that these homosexual men would constantly sexually harass him and try to have sex with him, even though they were literally dying from a disease that is a direct result of having male homosexual sex. This is how homosexual men operate. This is how they think. They do not think like normal, decent, sane, moral people. They think like mentally ill degenerates, because that is what they are. These homosexual men not only did not care that their behavior would be considered depraved by every psychologically healthy heterosexual, but they also didn't care that if this man had accepted their sexual advances, that they would be infecting this man with AIDS. Homosexuals are raging narcissists, whose entire lives are ruled by their perverted sexual impulses. Do you think men this sick could ever be capable of love and fidelity in the way that heterosexuals are? The homosexual community would like the general public to believe that their behavior is no different from the heterosexual community, but, as can be seen, the male homosexual population is so much more promiscuous, and their sexual practices so much more degenerate and physically damaging, that there is no comparison. And as Dr. Day mentioned in the previous quote, life-threatening sexually transmitted diseases, as well as life-destroying and life-ending rectal injuries, can still be acquired in monogamous male homosexual relationships. Meanwhile, it is basically impossible to acquire sexually transmitted diseases in monogamous heterosexual relationships. as long as anal sex is avoided. Unlike heterosexuals who very rarely engage in anal sex, and who only engage in anal sex because they saw it in porn, heterosexuals have zero sexual need to engage in anal for penetration. Meanwhile, homosexual men have no choice but to engage in anal for penetration, and anal sex causes severe diseases and injuries even if the partners are strictly monogamous. But as we have already established, monogamy is basically non-existent in the male homosexual population, which makes the inherent negative physical consequences of anal sex much worse. Also, even though anal sex is a perverted and disgusting activity even when done by heterosexuals, an activity that causes many diseases such as chronic hepatitis from feces exposure, intestinal parasites, fecal incontinence, and more, it is still less physically harmful for women than for men. The female immune system is biologically designed to be able to withstand the natural immunosuppressive effects of male semen when it is absorbed into the female body. However, the male immune system is not. Nature really does not like male homosexuality. There is no such thing as safe sex for the male homosexual. So even if male homosexuals were capable of monogamy in marriage, homosexuality should still be rejected by all sane and logical people because it causes deadly and contagious diseases. University of Chicago sociologist Edward Lauman says in his book that typical gay city inhabitants spend most of their adult lives in transactional relationships or short-term commitments of less than 6 months. Besides the fact that homosexual men fail at monogamy, they are also far more abusive than heterosexual men towards their partners, which is not surprising considering the fact that male homosexual sex is always abusive. The incidence of domestic violence among gay men is nearly double that of the heterosexual population. Also, people forget that men are naturally competitive with other men, and homosexual men are no different. Men and women are designed to complement, support, and cherish each other's inherent differences. Competition within a relationship is a recipe for chaos. It is, of course, impossible for homosexual couples to complement each other because of their inherent sameness. Just imagine how dysfunctional male homosexual couples are, since they are constantly competing with each other.